Great. We're rolling. You can see red light. Great. Okay, so you were born in January of
I was born on January 11th, 1922 in Summit, Oregon. And my brothers and sisters were all quite a bit older than I was. My youngest sister was 10 years older than I was. And when the last time I saw the house I was born in, it was being used as a goat shed. And it's completely fallen down now, nothing but blackberry briars. The roads were almost impassable in the wintertime because they were only dirt roads. There weren't even any gravel roads till we got to Blodgett. And so whenever they went any place in the car, they carried axes and shovels and burlap bags and cut branches and trees, and you were very careful to pick your rut because you were going to be in it for the next 8 miles at least. And I have seen cars when I was a little kid mired down to the body of the car, and people out with shovels digging them out.
So say something about before the Great Depression. You didn't feel like there was what it was like before the Great Depression. Just say something about that.
I don't remember too much before the Depression because I was only 7 when it hit. I remember the day it hit. I was visiting a little girl in Eugene, Oregon, and her mother and father lost everything in the banks, and the mother pulled down all the blinds in the house, and they took me home to Veneta. At that time, we'd moved to Veneta. And I remember how sad the woman was. She was crying. That's mostly what I remember of that day, because my folks didn't have any money in the bank.
And then after the when the Great Depression hit, so that lasted until what, 40-ish? Like it was 29 to 40.
It was 29 till actually
41.
Roosevelt.
Well, Roosevelt came in
The Depression lasted until Roosevelt, and he started the WPA and the 3 Cs, and that gave the men their pride back because they could work and earn money. And my dad was...
Can you start that over and say what each of the initial things mean? Like the WPA is the Workers' Program of America. But so say the Great Depression. Let's just back up a little bit and talk about how the Great Depression affected you and your family.
Well, the Depression was, for a little kid, I had enough to eat, but it was, I'm sure, at the expense of my parents. They would, I know that they would save things for me, and if there was something left on my plate, Daddy always said I didn't have to eat it because he'd eat it. And I realize now that he was probably not full. We ate a lot of tomatoes. Mama raised and canned tomatoes, and we ate a lot of beans, and she could make a pound of bacon go a long ways by making gravy. And they always had a garden, but it was, and of course my 2 brothers-in-law always had wild meat, which they shared with us, even though it wasn't in season. But everybody, the game wardens were all very understanding. If they took meat and used it all, they had a tendency to turn a blind eye toward it. I know when I was in high school, I had 1 dress, and my grandma had just got a pension of $80 a month, and she gave Mama $1.25 to go buy me a dress because I didn't have anything decent to wear to high school. And I hated it, but I washed it at night and ironed it in the morning and wore it the second day until we got some more money and I got a dress. During the Depression, before the sawmills really shut down, my dad had work, but it was very low pay. And I remember he always saved me something in his lunch bucket. And I didn't appreciate it then. I always ran to meet him and got the little half a sandwich or a little piece of cake or a cookie or something that he saved for me in his lunch bucket. I had wonderful parents. My father actually slapped me one time for sassing my mother, and it's the only time I ever remember him touching me in anger, ever. And I cried for hours because Daddy hit me. Now, Mama could spank me, but that didn't bother me, but Daddy hit me. And I just thought that was, oh, okay, when Franklin Roosevelt started the workers.
One more thing. Can we do one more thing before we move on to that? Can you tell a story about that Christmas where you got tiddlywinks and the
we
beach
were
ball?
down in Bend, Oregon.
So start the whole
during
thing.
During one Christmas that I remember, during one Christmas I remember, we got, on Christmas morning I got a set of tiddlywinks and a beach ball with a patch on it. And I was telling my friends that it was used, but it was still good. And my mother overheard them say that and heard me say that. And she said, "What made you think it was used?" And I said, "Well, it had a patch on it." And she said, "Well, we were playing with it and our dog Chip bit a hole in it. They had to patch it with a tire patching." Works Project Administration was what Roosevelt started, Franklin Roosevelt, and the Senate Civilian Conservation Corps, which was for young men. And my father went to work on WPA, Works Project, and was able to earn a few dollars an hour. It was like maybe $1.75, maybe $2 an hour. And they built roads and did all sorts of, I know they built parks. I know Mount Hood, the big lodge at the top of Mount Hood was built by WPA labor. The young men were able to get a little money. They had to send most of their money home. They were able to keep about $10 a month for their needs, and the rest of the money that they got, which wasn't much, was sent home to their families, because there were bread lines. I remember hearing about bread lines and soup lines where people would line up just to get some bread or some soup in the bigger cities. Of course, we lived in small towns, and it might have been a little easier in small towns because people helped each other.
Okay.
When the war started, then people got back to work. And I can't remember what I got an hour, but it wasn't much. I know I worked in Pennsylvania for 50 cents an hour. And when I went to work for the post office, I was getting $3.86 an hour, and I thought I had the world by the tail. That was so much money. It's more than I ever got for anything. During the war, World War II, it was rationing. I was married by then, and we had to tell them how many jars of fruit we were going to can, because we got a half a cup of sugar for each jar of fruit we were going to can. And bacon was rationed, coffee was rationed, butter was rationed, gasoline was rationed. It was just, you made do with what you got. And then during the war, wages started to go up and men got jobs. Of course, we had to mobilize the whole country to win the war. which we did, and England was losing it. And when we went over there, the song "We Won't Be Back Till It's Over There." And my nephew was the only one of our family that was in the service, and he was on the South Dakota, and he felt so much safer on the South Dakota, a battleship, than he would have on anything else. And he wouldn't take leave because he was afraid the ship would sail while he was on leave and he'd be put on something small. I remember Frank Adamich, who I worked with down at the post office for 11 years, said that he was on an ammunition carrier when Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and they were out in the middle of the ocean. They were headed for the Philippines full of ammunition, and he said they had no problem getting watchmen at night and on the daytime because everybody was on the deck that wasn't working, was on the deck watching for Japanese fighters, because if they'd ever hit them, there would have been nothing left because they were loaded with ammunition.
I think you they have something on your shirt right here, I think.
Sure.
I just figured that would be something we want to get rid of. Because this camera is
Block that out.
this camera's high def. So we got a little bit of pasta there for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so why don't you tell us the story about when you heard about D-Day? When you found out that D-Day had happened, that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Not D-Day, sorry. Pearl Harbor.
When Pearl Harbor was attacked, I was standing in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania, all dressed, ready to go to work. That's when I worked for 50 cents an hour. And we had the radio on, and we heard President Roosevelt announce that the Japanese had hit Pearl Harbor and that we were at war. And it was horrifying because soon after that we went to Baltimore, and my husband worked in the shipyards at Baltimore until he got a call from a man in Philomath, Oregon, wanting him to come back and work for him in the woods, which was, you had priorities in the jobs. You couldn't quit a job and go to work for a job that was lower priority. You had to work up. And by going back to the woods had more priority than the shipyards. So he could go to work in the woods. And he asked us how much money we would need to come back to Oregon to work for him. And Kenneth said he thought we could do it with $200 plus his paycheck from the shipyards. And the day we were to leave Baltimore, it snowed 3 feet, which never does in Baltimore, and they were not prepared. They had no snow plows or anything. So we had to wait 3 more days, and we drove across the country in a 1931 Chevrolet, with 2 little boys, with the standard shift, and they weren't very big cars then. And we had beds in the back seat for the boys. And I drove nights, and Kenneth drove days. And we stopped one night coming across the United States. It took us 6 days. And we got one night's sleep. Kenneth slept nights, and I drove and took care of the babies in the daytime. Napped when I could, when they were asleep, and that was about all the sleep I got. When we got to Hood River at 9 o'clock one night, it's about an hour and a half from Portland, and it was before the new highway on the river. It was the scenic highway up on the mountain, and it took us from 9 o'clock in the evening till 6:30 the next morning to get to Portland because we were so dead for sleep we couldn't keep our eyes open. And it was too cold to stop, and we couldn't stop and leave the car running for heat because of little boys in the back seat. So we just had to keep going about 20-25 miles an hour. And Kenneth hit the guardrail twice, but we were going so slow it didn't. And we got to Philomath with we got to Portland with $1.30. So we were very adventurous. Whenever we went someplace, we counted on having flat tires because we couldn't afford a jack. And so Kenneth would pick up the bumper, get a hold of the bumper and pick it up while I shoved a block of wood under the axle. And we changed the tire, took the inner tube out, passed the inner tube, pumped the tire up, brought the inner tube back up, put it back in the tire and put it back on the car, and away we went. We were young and foolish.
Okay, so what was it like working as a Rosie the Riveter type person?
I was a 3-plate welder, which means I did flat, vertical, and overhead welding. And it took me 3 days to learn to hold the arc, because every time I'd strike the arc, my hand would automatically fly up in the air. And when I finally was able to hold the arc, then I could weld. And I would slip into the shipyard early for my shift and get 2 what they called cracker boxes, which were the motors that ran the welders, and hook them together, which wasn't supposed to be done, but that way my welds held. I had more power. And it was so cold in that assembly shop. It was just bitterly cold in the summertime. And because of all the illnesses and everything, by that time we had 3 children. And there were so many children in Vanport that we decided to send the little boys to a farm with some friends for the summer. And then a neighbor lady took care of Carolyn. And that way we managed. But that was just for the summer. And then I quit. And Kenneth got in a little problem with the union and got blackballed. And so he went to work for Cooperage, which had a little better priority than the shipyards. And his first paycheck, he got a pink slip. And so then we went back to the woods, which was the only thing that we could do that was only the higher priority than the shipyards. And so, and then, I don't know if we're to 1951 yet?
Not quite.
Okay.
Okay, I was gonna ask. Now I want to talk about the Victory Days.
VJ Day. Everybody heard it on the radio. That's all we had then, was just the radio. And everybody